It all began in a land marked by pain. It was not just any place. It was Nod, the destination Cain received after killing his brother. There, where the ground still seemed cursed, where the dust carried memories of spilled blood, Methusael was born. A boy from the lineage of Cain, born with the weight of a name and the shadow of a past that was not his, but which already followed him like a stubborn shadow. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. At that time, the world was still in its infancy. There were no kingdoms, no laws, only the instinct to survive. Cain's children began to build, to organize, to create some semblance of civilization. But the mark of their ancestor was there, visible in their suspicious eyes, in their fear of the unknown, in the way men looked over their shoulders, as if expecting punishment at any moment. It was in this setting that Methuselah took his first steps, a boy among silent ruins and unfulfilled promises. His birth was not celebrated with a party. No one made much of it back then. It was a matter of being born, growing up, fighting, and trying not to die too soon. But there was something different about him. The elders noticed a strange calmness in the boy, as if he could see more than his eyes could see. He listened quietly, observed everything, and even without saying much, seemed to understand more than he should. At night, when the stars seemed to whisper ancient secrets, Methusael would stare at the sky as if waiting for an answer. He didn't know it yet, but that feeling in his chest, that quiet restlessness, would accompany him throughout his life. Something inside him told him that the world was not just that there was more, and that maybe he had a role in it all. But before he could understand what he was feeling, it was time to learn from the men who came before him. Men hardened by time, marked by guilt, and trapped in stories that had not yet ended. Growing up with a name like Methusael was no easy task. In times when names carried the weight of destiny, he carried a question on his back that seemed to burn in the air every time someone called him, "Who belongs to God?" That was what his name meant. As if with every call, the universe threw down the same challenge. "Hey, Methusael, who do you belong to?" While other boys ran free among the tents, he felt that name like a bell ringing loudly inside his chest. Not that he was unhappy, he was just different. At home, there was little room for conversation. His father, METHUSAEL, was a tough man, of few words and many scars. He had that tired look of someone who had seen more than he wanted to and said less than he should have. Methuselah grew up hearing more silence than stories. What he knew about life, he learned by watching and feeling. Little by little, he began to understand that his family carried a kind of weight that was not seen on their shoulders, but in their souls. An emptiness that came from his grandfather Irad, and before that, from Cain himself. It was as if everyone in that line had tried to fix something that broke long ago, but never knew exactly how. Each generation, a new attempt. Each mistake, a legacy. Methusael, still young, began to realize this. He began to see how the men around him dealt with guilt. Some pretended it didn't exist, others lost themselves in strength, others tried to build in order to forget. But he watched. And as much as he carried the name that provoked him, he still didn't know what to do with it. He only knew that something was about to change. Because the world around him was no longer just dust and survival. Cities were emerging, men were ceasing to be just men, and in the midst of it all, he felt the need to choose a path, one that would take him away from everything he knew until then. Time passed, and Methusael began to understand that his story was not his alone. It was tied up in a tangle of ancient names. Names he had heard since he was a child, spoken in low tones, as if they carried the dust of secrets. His father, Methusael, was the son of Irad, who in turn was the son of Enoch. Not that Enoch, the righteous one, but another, the one Cain built a city in honor of. Yes, the Enoch who was born of pain and the attempt to erase an ancient mistake. METHUSAEL grew up watching these men try to tame life with their hands, as if they could control what was inside by building outside. Irad was remembered as a steadfast man who wanted to turn desert into village, dust into road. METHUSAEL took this from his father, the desire to make things happen, but without fully understanding what he was trying to fix. It was like building a house on sand and with each storm trying to rebuild it with the same pieces of wood. At home, METHUSAEL didn't find many answers. His father talked about work, responsibility, maintaining the family line, but none of that touched what he felt inside. It wasn't just restlessness. It was as if an ancient, muffled voice was asking for something that didn't yet exist. He wanted to know where it came from, yes, but even more, where it was going. And it was in this void, between the echoes of those who came before and the urgency of a greater meaning, that he began to search for something that no one around him seemed to understand. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't a thirst for power. It was as if his soul was calling for a place that was not yet on the map of men. But all this became more urgent when Cain's children began to multiply and shape the world in their image. METHUSAEL reached adulthood at a strange time. The world seemed to be growing too fast, like a plant that sprouts suddenly and wants to cover everything with its branches. Men were learning to shape metals, create musical instruments, build tents and cities. It was an explosion of inventions, of new ideas, a real breakthrough. But along with this, pride, vanity, and the feeling that man could do anything also grew. He saw this with attentive eyes. It was not just any time. It was a time when men wanted to be remembered, wanted to make a name for themselves, to leave their mark. Everything was about power. And in this game, the strongest ruled. The law was simple. Those who had strength made the rules, and those who didn't had to hide. METHUSAEL was not one of those. He did not have the strength of warriors, nor the hunger for glory of builders, but he had something rare, lucidity. It was as if he could see deeper, behind the masks, behind the achievements. He saw the haste of men as one who watches a house being built without a foundation. It was bound to collapse. While everyone else sought to stand out, he remained quiet. He observed, he thought. It wasn't cowardice. It was ancient wisdom, the kind that listens before speaking, that feels before acting. This made him different, sometimes even a little strange in the eyes of others. But he knew that something was behind it all, as if an invisible cog was turning, pushing history to a place that no one there understood. And it was in the midst of this turmoil that METHUSAEL had a son, a strong boy full of energy, with eyes that seemed to carry a fire that was difficult to contain. His name, Lamech, and with him would come a new twist in the story, one that would bring more questions than answers. Lamech was born like thunder in a sky that was already heavy. From an early age, it was impossible to ignore him. He had a firm gait, a voice that always seemed louder than necessary, and eyes that never looked down on anyone. If Methuselah was all about silence and observation, Lamech was pure action. Where his father thought, his son already acted. Where his father pondered, his son had already decided. In his youth, Lamech stood out. He was strong, yes, but that wasn't all. He had presence. Wherever he went, the air changed. Others followed him, sometimes out of respect, sometimes out of fear. And that shaped who he became. Lamech learned early on that he could impose his will, that he could get whatever he wanted if he showed his teeth. METHUSAEL watched everything. Inside, he felt a tightness. It wasn't just a father's concern. It was as if he saw the old story repeating itself, as if Cain's mistakes, even covered by time, were coming back to the surface. Only now, inside his own home, he tried to teach his son to listen, to think, to contain his anger. But Lamech was a river in flood. He couldn't be held back with his hands. What hurt Methuselah the most was realizing that Lamech wasn't just repeating the mistakes of the ancients. He was doing worse. One day, his son came home with his chest puffed out and words as sharp as a knife. He had killed 2 men, and not out of necessity but out of pride. He said that if Cain was avenged 7 times, he should be avenged 77 times. An affront. A cry of power thrown in the face of the world, and worse, he believed it with all his might. It was at that moment that Methuselah realized how much the world around him was moving away from everything that was still sacred. Because it wasn't just Lamech, it was the whole earth. After that day, Methuselah changed. Not on the outside. He remained quiet, with the same gaze that always seemed stuck in another time. But on the inside, something broke and spread. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of silent pain, the kind that makes no noise but leaves everything different. The son he had brought into the world now walked as if he were bigger than the world itself, and he, the father, could only watch. He thought a lot about where he had failed. Was it his parenting? Was Lamech born this way with this fury in his chest? But the more he tried to understand, the more he realized that perhaps the hole was deeper. Maybe it wasn't just about his son. Maybe it was about the whole land, the time they lived in, the spirit of things. It was difficult to find hope. Violence no longer shocked anyone. Killing had become power. Being feared was worth more than being fair. And in the midst of it all, Methuselah began to feel that Cain's guilt had not remained in the past. It was like an underground river that was springing up again, stronger and stronger. Only now, the whole world seemed to be drinking from it. Even so, he did not let his heart harden. He did not give in to resentment. Something inside him still shone, small, fragile, but alive. A strange, almost stubborn faith that everything could still change, that perhaps, even with everything falling apart, God was still near. Silent, yes, but watching, waiting for the right moment. And it was during this wait that METHUSAEL began to pay attention to the signs, to the way the days seemed heavier, to the empty look in people's eyes, to the silence of the sky. It was as if something was approaching, something no one talked about but everyone felt. It didn't take long for METHUSAEL to realize that what he was feeling wasn't just in his head. The world really was different. It was as if the ground had become drier, the air heavier, people's eyes darker. There was a rush in everything, a rush to build, to dominate, to show strength. But no one stopped to listen, to think, to feel. It was a time that was noisy on the outside and empty on the inside. He observed everything with his characteristic calm. The fields were full, the cities were growing, but the hearts of the people seemed increasingly distant from God. There was no reverence, only fear, vanity, and an endless thirst for power. Men no longer sought meaning, they sought control. They wanted to be remembered, even if it cost them their souls. At night, METHUSAEL looked up at the sky and felt that something was about to happen, like the silence before a storm. He didn't know what or when, but everything around him pointed to some kind of end, or a new beginning. He couldn't be sure. It was as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Some even whispered about it, as if it were a sin to think that God was still watching. But METHUSAEL knew. He knew by the way the animals were more restless, by the way the weather changed without warning, by the way the days passed without joy. It was as if the whole of creation was waiting for something. A cut, a cry, an answer. He didn't talk about it with anyone, not even with Lamech. He kept it to himself. But with each passing day, that certainty grew stronger within him. Something was coming, something big. And meanwhile, men continued to build, sing, and forge metals as if nothing was wrong, as if they were untouchable, as if they had all the time in the world. The cities grew like weeds. Every day a new tent appeared, a new furnace, a new song coming from some strange instrument. It was beautiful even. It looked like progress. But Methuselah saw it differently. To him, it was like painting a cracked wall. On the outside, everything shone, but on the inside, the emptiness only grew. Men spoke loudly, laughed, celebrated achievements as if that were all there was to life: strength, name, and territory. They had learned to manipulate sounds, metals, tools, but they had forgotten how to listen to the voice of the earth, the voice of the sky, the voice within. No one spoke with purpose anymore, only of power. METHUSAEL withdrew more and more. He stayed away from the bonfires, the parties, the noisy crowds, not out of bitterness, but because he didn't fit in. It was as if he belonged to another frequency, slower, deeper, a whisper in a world of screams. Meanwhile, his name faded away. He was no longer mentioned in the stories told at night. The young people hardly knew who he was, and him, he didn't care. He never sought glory. His presence was discreet but constant, like a shadow that walks alongside without making a fuss. And even without being noticed, he saw, he felt every movement of the earth, every change in the wind, every strange silence between conversations. Deep down, METHUSAEL knew he wasn't the protagonist of that era. But he also knew that his existence was part of something bigger, like a small piece in a huge puzzle, and even without a stage, even without fame, he carried a consciousness that no one else seemed to have, a kind of invisible watchman. And it was there, in that chosen silence, that he began to notice even clearer signs that others ignored or called coincidence. But for him, there was no doubt. Time was running out. Over time, METHUSAEL grew old. His hair turned white without haste, his steps grew shorter, and his marked skin told stories that no one asked about anymore. He was no longer remembered at men's meetings, nor called upon by the younger ones. His name became an echo, a vague memory in the hurried mouths of the new generation. But even without a stage, he remained steadfast, eyes open, heart alert. The city around him continued to expand. Now there were even trading systems, rules of their own, structures reminiscent of governments. The men thought they were in control of everything, as if they owned time, the sky, the earth. And the more this grew, the more METHUSAEL remained silent. Not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. He knew that certain truths do not need to be shouted, they prove themselves at the right time. Some thought he was senile. Others thought he had surrendered to loneliness. No one knew that he silently carried the weight of generations, that he was one of the few still alive who remembered the roots, of the beginning of everything, of Cain's mark, of the fear that no one else seemed to have anymore. In the dead of night, he still looked up at the sky, and there was something new there, a different silence, as if the universe itself were preparing for something. A tremor in the air, a cold that did not come from the weather, but from the soul. The days went by one after another, and METHUSAEL slowly disappeared, like a candle burning silently until it turned to smoke in the air. No one knows when he died or how. No tent was erected in his honor, no song was sung. He left as he had lived, discreet, observant, carrying in his eyes more than words could explain. But what no one saw was that his story did not end there. It remained between the lines of time, hidden in the cracks of the grand narrative. Because while men lost themselves in fame and conquests, Methuselah left something rarer, an invisible mark. He was the bridge between what came before and what was to come, between the mistake that began with Cain and the hope that would begin with another name. That name reached Methuselah's ears in recent years, almost like a whispered promise. Enoch, a man who, unlike everyone else, walked with God. And this walk was not only physical, it was a journey of the soul. Enoch was of another lineage, but he carried a glow that reminded Methuselah of what he had always sought and never seen around him. And it was in this contrast that something ignited within him, something that crossed time even after his departure. Because METHUSAEL may not have built cities or won battles, but he held on to a silent faith when everyone else had given up. A faith that does not bow to the clamor of the world. A faith that waits, even when it seems that nothing will change. So if you look closely, you will see that METHUSAEL was not a hero like those who usually shine in stories. He had no great deeds, he did not found nations, he did not perform miracles. But even so, he remained. Not in books with big letters, but in the blank spaces, in the silence between chapters, in the invisible thread that holds history together. He lived in a noisy, confusing time, full of people chasing glory. And he chose another path, the path of listening, the path of waiting. The path of those who understand that not every answer comes quickly, and that sometimes the most valuable things are those that no one applauds. The greatest lesson METHUSAEL left behind was not spoken with words, but with his presence. He teaches us that it is possible to be faithful even when the whole world is going in the opposite direction, that you can carry hope without having to prove anything to anyone, and that the simple fact of continuing to believe, even in the midst of chaos, is already a form of resistance. His life shows that not every legacy is visible. Sometimes the strongest seed is the one planted in the dark, far from sight, waiting for the right time to sprout. And that's what he did. He kept a flame burning when everything around him seemed to want to extinguish it, a flame that would later be passed on, until it reached names like Enoch, Noah, and beyond. METHUSAEL was one of those characters that we hardly notice, but who sustain more than meets the eye. A reminder that living with purpose is not always about making noise. Sometimes it's just about not giving up. Just keep going. Just stand firm when everyone else has let go. And those who truly listen to his story understand the world may forget names like his, but God never forgets. If you liked METHUSAEL's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.